Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We are pleased to have with us Dr. Louise Bowers. Louise is a chartered and registered forensic psychologist and has been since 1995. She has worked in, and I had to write this bit down, several settings: prisons, youth offending, healthcare settings, the Parole Board, private practice, and universities. You name it, Louise has experience in it. So on top of this extensive list of experience, she has developed particular expertise in working with children and young people who are involved in the criminal justice system or who are at risk of offending. So welcome to Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We'll hit it off today, Louise, if that's okay, with a question about how did you get where you are today?
Goodness, like when you had Professor Gannon on, how far back do you want me to go?
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it all started off a very long time ago for me. Unfortunately, my father died when I was 11. And although at the time I didn't realise that set in a chain of events that I think has ended up with where I am now. So whilst I coped initially with that bereavement quite well initially, by the time I was doing my O-levels, and I'm old enough to do O-levels, not GCSEs, and A-levels, I was not coping well. But that was at a time when child mental ill health was not recognised. If I was working with a young person now who was presenting in an educational setting as I was presenting then, I would have sent them off to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, but that just wasn't the system at the time. So I sort of muddled through O-levels and A-levels and worked really, really hard. And I was all set to do pharmacy. I thought I was going to go off and be a pharmacist. And at the A-level stage, when I was doing my UCAS application, something changed and I decided that I was going to do psychology. I didn't know anything about it. If there was an A-level or an O-level in psychology at the time, I didn't know. It certainly wasn't available in my small sixth form. I was in a sixth form group at a local school. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I might give that a go. And looking back, I actually can't remember the decision-making process that went around me switching from pharmacy to psychology. And reflecting back, sometimes we work with people when they say, I just can't remember how I made that decision. I can't remember what was going on for me. And sometimes we're a little bit dismissive of that. But actually, I genuinely can't remember what underpinned that switch. And that decision, apart from psychology, sounded quite cool and quite interesting. I did okay in my A-levels and went off to Sheffield University. My mental health improved actually at university, and my mum remarried, and she remarried a teacher who was living in the southeast. I was born up in the north of the country. He was living in the southeast, and she moved to be with him, and he was a teacher in a boarding school, and they lived on site. And I used to visit in the holidays, and I began to notice these little dots of children wandering around the school who were boarding. Some of them were like 7 and 8 years old, and some of them were military families living away from their parents. And it just struck me how young they were to be living away from their families. And they also had day pupils on site. And it just wouldn't happen now. But I managed as my year 3 undergraduate dissertation to get ethical approval to interview these children and talk to them about their concept of family, given they were so young and didn't live with their families. And I compared that to a group of children who were day pupils who went home at night. The research at my undergraduate dissertation was really well received, and my supervisor at the time, Professor Peter Smith, got some funding from the Medical Research Council to expand the project. And he employed me as his research assistant. So I worked in research for 2 years at the University of Sheffield. And that was the start of my love of research and really homing in on research skills. And again, working with children and young people. And then one day, I noticed an advert in The Guardian for trainee forensic psychologists, although I'm not sure they were called that at the time, for the prison service. And they were going to fund people's masters. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll give that a go. And got it. So So I was sent off to Wakefield Prison, and was put onto a wing. I was very young, with hindsight probably too young to be working. I was on a wing working with residents who predominantly committed sexual murders or committed sexual offences and killed their victims. And I was very young, very, very young, but I was part of a brilliant team, absolutely brilliant team. It was one of the bigger psychology departments in the country at the time. I ran some of the pilot SOTP programs. I was very involved in research. I was very involved in delivering training. And when I qualified in 1995, I was offered the most amazing opportunity to transfer to Prison Survey headquarters and work with David Thornton and my dear friend Ruth Mann, the late Ruth Mann. And that was just the most amazing opportunity. We were the sex offender treatment program at that time as we were developing it. But what was also amazing at that time, after a couple of years, I talked to Ruth a lot. She was a dear friend as well as my manager, and she knew I wanted to work with children and young people. And an opportunity of a secondment came up at Feltham, and Ruth actively encouraged me to take that opportunity. She said, Louise, you need to go and do this, and I'm going to support you to go and take this secondment at Feltham. And I just loved it. It was just amazing. I was doing a lot of work with the very young men who'd committed sexual offences. And at that time in the mid-90s, they were all housed together. So you would have a 14-year-old in with a 21-year-old. They weren't separated, and there wasn't a particularly specialised service for them at that time. And this really struck me that this was wrong, that young lads' needs and how they presented was just different, and they shouldn't just be treated as little adults. We pretty much delivered the same sexual offenders treatment program to them, and assessed them in the same way. And this just really struck me as wrong. And I really wanted to do something about that. But then took one of the biggest mistakes in my career, but I learned a lot from that mistake. And I took a massive promotion to go and work at High Down Prison as a very senior manager of one of the biggest programs in the country. We were running every program that existed. But I realized pretty quickly, I'm a practitioner. I want to work with the residents. I didn't want to be managing a massive program and not having day-to-day contact with the residents. I hated it. It was probably the worst 18 months of my life. I think I began to become quite unwell during that time and knew I had to get out. And around the time I was realizing this was not a good place for me and it was impacting on my well-being and mental health. I also had a very young family at that time and it was impacting on everybody. I saw a job for a very low level. It was a band 7 psychologist working at St George's NHS Mental Health Trust. It was a newly qualified post and I took it. And that was one of the best decisions of my life. I worked 3 days a week in the youth offending team. So I was employed by St George's Mental Health NHS Trust, but I was out 3 days a week working in the youth offending team. And it was just lovely. And felt I was back where I belonged, doing work on the ground, helping them to set up a psychological services for the young people. I lived in Wimbledon, so a lot of the young people I knew the issues within my community, and it was just lovely to be part of that.
Such an important role, isn't it? And I was sitting nodding because I was thinking it's quite an interesting role for psychologists. I think sometimes the further up you go, the less contact you can have with people, and there's a real balance. We often talk about this in our sort of circles, saying you really need a balance of perhaps using your experience and leading, but also having that contact and all those years you train wanting to work with people.
Absolutely. But, there are some people who are very good managers and natural leaders, and their role is to do that and to develop services. And I have so much respect for them, but that just wasn't me. I am a practitioner. And there were several more steps, but that eventually ended up in private practice because I want to practice. That's what I want to do. I've missed out the 10 years on the Parole Board and all that, but I'm sure that will come out later. But that's pretty much, it was the Feltham job and then working in my local youth offending team and then leaving London, moving very rurally and setting up the practice because I wanted to practice and developing my practice more with young people through that.
But your career sounds so interesting and diverse, and you've got such a range of experiences, and it's really good to hear you describe that, because I think there isn't one pathway in and through this career, and it's really good to hear your variety and to show that you can have that variety. It's really helpful to hear that, Louise. So what does a day in the life of Louise look like then? Because it sounds like it's been all over the place.
Absolutely. In terms of the work, goodness, it could be anything. It might be actually carrying out an assessment. So at the moment, they're all done remotely. So I'll be like this. I'll be on the cloud video platform, perhaps remoting into a young offenders institution or a secure children's home or a secure training centre. Or maybe if the young person I'm assessing is in the community, I will have negotiated with them beforehand about whether they'd like to do that on Zoom or WhatsApp or FaceTime. So I might be doing an assessment. I spend quite a lot of time giving evidence, particularly in the Crown Courts and in Parole Board hearings. So again, we're in the pandemic, we're still in lockdown. That's all happening remotely at the moment. But when we're not in lockdown, I have to do quite a lot of driving. I work all over the country, so I'll be driving to court hearings and Parole Board hearings. I might be supervising. I supervise a number of trainee forensic psychologists on the BPS, the British Psychological Society route to qualification. I'm also clinical and academic supervisor for a number of students who are on the Cardiff postgraduate route to qualification. So I spend a lot of time supervising trainees. I do quite a lot of training, so I might be reviewing literature to develop training materials. Also, something I haven't mentioned so far, our private practice have a contract to provide forensic services to a group of alternative education providers. So 2 days a fortnight, I am elsewhere in the country actually doing direct work with students who are in trouble with the police or with the law or within the criminal justice system, or supporting staff who are working with those students. I think working in private practice can be very, very lonely at times. I spend a lot of time in my office here on my own. And so I have a network of peers, and particularly my business partner, Emma Stevenson. So we engage in a lot of peer supervision. As well as part of being reflective practice, it's important for mental health and well-being to be able to process some of the material that we work with. You're all nodding. I know you can relate to that. Some of the material we work with is really distressing. Distressing to read, distressing to see the impact on the young people I'm working with, but also mindful of the families and the victims who've been harmed by the people that we work with. And it is distressing at times, and it's really important, I think, as practitioners that we have that peer supervision. But as an independent practitioner, you have to seek that out and develop that, whereas if you're employed, that would be part of your employment.
And has it had an impact working at home with that material? Because we've done quite a bit of work within the British Psychological Society about the impact of the pandemic on people working at home, and I wondered how that had impacted on you, having that material in your home rather than separate in another place.
I mean, I started the private practice in 2005, so a long time ago now, and I've had to adapt and adjust to that over time. And at that time, I was a member of the Parole Board, so I would routinely have dossiers here as well. So I've built in systems and practices to help me cope with that. But what I've noticed in my supervision, particularly the students I supervise on behalf of the prison service, suddenly being pulled out a year ago of prisons and sent home to work, the impact on them has been massive, of suddenly this material encroaching on their life, and having to read this material in their kitchen or in their lounge and not wanting it there. And I completely related to that. For example, one of my trainee forensic psychologist just did not feel comfortable doing a particularly difficult parole board hearing, which she knew was going to be very challenging and the material was very difficult. She did not want to do that from her home. And so she made arrangements to put in a special request to the governor to go and do that within the prison. And actually what was really lovely is she went into the prison and actually was socially distanced from the resident, but actually in the same room as the resident. The room was massive and well ventilated. And actually that served a dual function, because she was actually able to support the resident in the parole hearing, who I've noticed oftentimes are just left in their room on their own in the parole board hearings currently with no support because their solicitor's remote. So she was able to support the resident physically by being in the room but socially distant, and did not have to have what she knew was going to be a very challenging hearing taking place in her kitchen. So we've worked really hard to make that feel safer and less intrusive for trainee forensic psychologists. But it's such an important point you raised, Jerry, the impact on them of having to suddenly, with no warning, work from their homes.
We've had lots of discussions in our service as well, Louise, about that very point. And, you know, lots of junior staff who are still developing their craft, and I think, you know, developing their skill and their resilience, and then all of a sudden having to one day just work from home with really difficult materials. So we've had lots of discussions around how we can support them, and maybe changing their working day and constantly changing it as well, I think, because one week might be okay, but the next will be very, very different. And I guess that's in some ways the impact of the collective trauma, I think, in some ways.
I think it's all of us. I think we'd all feel the same having that sort of material in our home, because most of us, I think, will have developed a strategy of leaving it at the prison gate or the hospital gate, and then not to be able to do that, it's been difficult for people. So I think it's really important, and I guess we've got a responsibility as supervisors to raise it as an issue as well, because it might be more difficult for supervisees to raise it or even realise that's what they're feeling. Because I was really struck by when you talked about your journey, about how I think a lot of us will go into a job to do something that we wanted done for us, and almost that sort of offering young people the service you didn't have. And I think that's really important, that we often don't know that's a driver for us, but we recognise actually maybe that's something we're trying to do.
Tell us about working with children who offend.
If you're going to work with children, young people and young adults, you need specialist training to move into that area, or, you know, CPD. I think there's a bit of a feeling sometimes that they're just little adults, and that we can apply the same assessment approach and intervention approach and just perhaps use different language. And that just isn't enough. Everything about working with children and young people and young adults is different. So there are different measures, for example. So where with an adult, you might use a HCR 20 to assess violence as one option. For young people, you would be thinking about perhaps using something called the SAVRE, which is a structured violence risk assessment for youth. The same if you were assessing a young person who'd engaged in sexually harmful behaviour. You might think about using there's a measure called the Professor. Whereas with an adult, there'd be a different measure for using with adults. So the whole assessment approach is different. I work very systemically. So if I'm assessing a young person, I would never assess them just in isolation. You have to engage with the family as well, or the carers if they're in care. You need to understand the care system. A lot of the young people I work with are care experienced. They might currently be in the care of the local authority or have been, so they've been care experienced, and that's the same for some of the young adults I work with as well. So you really need to understand the care system. You need to work systemically with the family. So it's not only about working with a young person, you have to have the skills to engage the family or the carers. You need to be able to engage, if they're in education, with their teachers and get a sense for how they are in education. So that really broad systemic working is pretty critical. Young people can be really difficult to engage. They can be quite impulsive. Due to the nature of their development, you need to really understand developmental psychology. They're living in the here and now, a lot of them. They won't appreciate the longer term benefits of engaging. If they get the offer to go off on a stolen moped, they're likely to take that rather than come to the session with me. they can be quite difficult to engage, particularly within the community. If I'm assessing a young person who's already in custody, you've got a bit more of a captive audience, they're more likely to engage, but engaging people in the community can be really, really challenging. So there's lots and lots of different issues. The same with intervention. They might sign up for intervention, but actually getting them to come to sessions can be quite challenging.
And are there any, like, I guess, differences between adults who offend and kind of young people who offend in terms of motivation, Louise, in your experience?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, a lot of the young people I work with are very impulsive, and we know from sort of neuroscience, a lot of the brain research that's happening now, that children's and young adults' brains continue to mature well into their mid-20s. And particularly those aspects of the brain that's around impulse control and decision making, and those higher executive functions, they develop much later. So young people will typically engage in very impulsive offending. They very rarely think about the consequences of what they're doing, even if they understand it's wrong. Assessing children, young adults' maturity is huge at the moment. So very often, when I get instructions to work with young people, solicitors now will ask me to assess maturity and the level of culpability that young person has for their offending. And that is very different from a fully mature adult. Even, you know, young men in their early 20s, I'll be asked to assess how mature are they and whether that's relevant to what they did. I'm part of an advisory board who are developing a set of sentencing principles specifically for young adults. So recognising that when young people become 18, there's not a cliff edge. They're not suddenly at the age of 18 a mature adult. And whilst the law might view them as an adult and the law might sentence them as an adult, the 18 to 25s are a really special group, and their offending is different and might still be influenced by things like impulsivity, lack of maturity. And so I'm part of an advisory board who are developing a set of principles and working with judges and magistrates to consider that when they're sentencing young adults, to think about maturity and to think about the damage a custodial sentence might do to somebody who's still developing, and to try and think, you know, is there another way that we can punish this young person, but actually think about their needs and support them and to develop their strengths rather than putting them in custody. You know, can we develop a plan where we can keep our community safe, but actually have them in the community working on what they need to work on? So that's a really exciting piece of work, and that acknowledgement that even, you know, young people in their mid-20s are different to an adult and do offend for different reasons.
What are some of the key factors that influence that idea about maturity? And I'm thinking, just, we've talked a lot on our sessions about trauma and the impact of perhaps just not even just trauma, but experiences that they go through.
Absolutely. A lot of young people I work with are traumatized, and very often what's different to working with adults, that trauma is ongoing. So I may be working with a young person who has committed an offence or an alleged offence, but they're a victim currently and actively at that moment as well. So they might be living in an abusive environment. They might be in a gang where they're being exploited or abused, or they're in fear all the time. I work with a lot of young people who are arrested for drug offences. But actually, when you start to unpick that, they're very potentially part of a county lines where they've been exploited themselves, but have been charged. So that's a really real issue you have to deal with, is that they are very often, whilst they may have committed offence, they're also actively, at the time you're working with them, a victim at the same time. And that can be quite challenging to work with as well.
I imagine having to keep in mind that victim perpetrator. So now we've talked about this before as well, that having to keep both of those positions in mind.
Very much so.
And how much sympathy is there for that then within the criminal justice system, do you think? Are they able to see both sides of a young person?
Yeah, I see that very much as my part of my job, particularly when I'm assessing young people for the Crown Court, to get that view across. Yes, they may have committed a serious offence, but actually look at what's happened to them as well. And I very much take the approach when I'm working with young people, very much influenced by the power, threat, meaning framework. I start from the point of, tell me what's happened to you, not what is wrong with you. Tell me your story, and we'll get to what the police have alleged you've done or what you've pleaded guilty to later. Tell me your story. Tell me what's happened to you in your life, and I'm here to listen. And that's quite a useful way to start off with young people, showing that interest in their life and what's happened to them, not what they've currently been accused of or been convicted of. And I think that's really important.
Oh, so you mentioned being an expert witness.
Yes.
So what does that entail exactly?
Absolutely. An expert witness is somebody who has the knowledge, skills, experience, and qualifications to be able to give an opinion to a court or a tribunal on a specific aspect of a case they're working on. So the bar's quite high to be an expert witness. You have to be one of a few people in your field who could give that view. So that's the starting point. And I'm on the expert witness, the British Psychological Society Expert Witness Advisory Group. And I currently am the only, me and Liam are the forensic psychologist, Liam Craig, the forensic psychologist members of that. Of course, Liam's a clinical psychologist as well. So we put forward the views of what it's like to be an expert witness and the issues for expert witnesses who are also forensic psychologists, and all the different psychologists are represented on that expert witness advisory group. So the bar's quite high. You need to do specialist training to be an expert witness, or you should do training to be an expert witness, and it will involve giving advice and opinion to the court on specialist issues. So in my area, what I tend to give expert evidence on, I do a lot of cases around young people and young adults' fitness to plead. So are they actually fit to put a plea in and work with their solicitor to prepare a case? And aligned to that, but slightly different, effective participation. So are they able to effectively participate in their trial? And that means engage meaningfully. So not just sit there as a passive observer of their trial, but actually engage with it, listen to the evidence, understand the evidence. If they think there's something wrong with the evidence, would they be able to tell their solicitor that? How are they likely to respond to cross-examination? Are they likely to just give in and say yes and no? Are they likely to sort of yield to leading questions? Are they likely to get very anxious? Are they likely to get very angry if they're in cross-examination? So I advise a lot on those sorts of issues, whether young people have got mental health issues that might impact on their capacity to engage in a trial. And then if young people have been convicted, very often I'm asked to come in and present what is their risk. So very often the issue is I work a lot with very, very serious offenders. So young people who've killed other people, so children who've killed other people. I work with young people who've committed very, very serious sexual offences. So these young people are sometimes facing life or extended sentences, and I'll be called in to give a view on whether that's necessary for that young person, or whether there's any way that their risk could be managed another way, for example, within a determinate sentence. Or sometimes I'm working with a young person who's offending as what we call cross the custody threshold. So their offending is so serious and so much harm is being caused that the judge in the case or the magistrate could give a custodial sentence. And I'll be called in to say, again, is that absolutely necessary in this case? Or is there a package that you could put together, or could you advise on a package where their risk could be managed in the community rather than in custody? And often the judges and magistrates want to know the research around that. What underpins my risk assessment? What underpins my evidence that this can be managed in the community? And I work collaboratively then with the youth offending team officer to say, okay, I think this young person would be okay if these things were in place. Could you put those things in place so that we can keep them out of custody? Because we know how damaging custody is for young people who are still developing. Having said that, I work with young people who there is no other way. And I completely accept that there are some children and young people whose offending is so serious and have caused so much harm that actually they do need to be taken out of society for a while whilst we work on their needs and try and build their strengths and their resilience, and work with them. And I completely accept that there are young people who have to have a custodial sentence.
I remember working with this young person who was probably at the time, because I suppose in prisons we have some settings that take 15 to 18s, and I remember this one young person who, as soon as his sentence was coming up to finish, he would smash up his cell and he'd try and get extra days to sort of stay in custody, because he felt safer where the door was locked, even though he was with complete strangers really. But his preference was to almost stay in prison, because actually what was outside would have been worse for him.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I've had that experience as well, Laura. And one of the other things I do is at the other end of the scale. So when there's young people who've come in when they're very young, I've worked with some young people who've got life sentences or long extended when they've been 11, 12, 13. What I also do is then assess them as young adults, whether I've worked with them or not. Sometimes I'm meeting them for the first time as a young adult and assessing their risk for parole. So are they safe now to be released? And a lot of the young adults I work with who have been released in their early 20s, what I found, and there's no research yet to back this up, but it would be a brilliant piece of research, a lot of them are recalled. Exactly saying, Laura, they think it's going to be great. They go out and actually it doesn't work out like they thought it was going to be. They realise that they've missed out on so many developmental experiences. I was working with a lad recently who's just come back in, a young man, and he said, I just didn't know how to relate to young men of my age. I thought they were looking at me differently. I haven't got a driving license. the phones have moved on. I didn't know how to use social media, and I was just different, and I just couldn't relate to my peers. And that is one of the impacts of locking young men and young women up for a long time. And absolutely, I've had young men exactly like that, Laura, come back in and go, "Whew, I'm safe now. I'm safe. I'm back in my safe place." And that's incredibly sad that some people actually feel they can cope better in prison than they can in the community because of those developmental experiences that they've missed out on.
Could you say a bit more, Louise, about fitness to plea, what that means?
Absolutely. So that's around whether young people understand what they've done. Do they understand the nature of what they've been charged with? Do they understand that's wrong and illegal? And I must say, it's very rare for me to work with somebody. I work with a lot of young people who've got an intellectual disability, and I might be diagnose that as part of my assessment. I've done additional training to be able to diagnose that. But even with people with an intellectual disability, most of them, for example, understand that you should not engage sexually with children, or that you should not stab somebody, even as they know that. So it's quite rare for them not to understand that. But then it's about, can they work effectively with their solicitor to prepare their case? Will they actually be able to understand when their solicitor explains to them, okay, what's your defence? Will they be able to explain that or understand what defences might be open to them? Would they actually be able to understand the actual court process they're about to face? Will they be able to understand and process information that's given to them about whether to plead guilty or not? Will they be able to retain that information and weigh it up as part of a reasoning process? And that's all the things about fitness to plead. It's a really fascinating area of work, actually, that clinical psychologists are equally involved in as forensic psychologists. It's that real interface between somebody's presentation and functioning and the law. And it's an absolutely fascinating area to work. It's an area of my work I really enjoy. But I must say, it's incredibly rare for me to say that somebody's not fit to plead. And particularly with young people, there's a whole raft of measures that you can put in place to support them. So the simple things like, people not wearing wigs, the solicitors and barristers not wearing wigs and gowns. The judge may be coming down from the high up seat to a lower level. If it's safe, the young person can perhaps sit with their family rather than being in the glass dock. All of that helps. There's some specialist solicitors who work with children, getting one of them involved who's done additional training to be able to communicate more effectively with children and young adults. And then, of course, there's the intermediaries. Intermediaries are special communications experts. They're not expert witnesses, but they assess defendants and witnesses' ability to communicate with the court. And again, they can sit with the defendant. In this case, I would only ever be assessing defendants, and support them, and sort of they establish what's called ground rules for how the young person is going to be questioned. So, and they can advise the court about using simple language, only ask one question at a time. So if you're asking one question, only have one bit of question in that question, not three questions in one question. Simple language, lots of breaks, and they can interrupt if they think the young person has been asked a question they're unlikely to understand, or if they think the barristers are slipping into leading questions, they can stop proceedings and say, could you ask that question in a different way? So the intermediaries are amazing, absolutely amazing, and massively supportive of young people. And I often recommend that if a young person had an intermediary with them to support that two-way communication with the court, they probably would be okay to get through their trial. So there's a lot of support we can put in for young people. And it is important that if they are able to engage and go through the court process, that we support them to do that. It's important for them, it's important for the victims, and it's important for justice that we do that if we can.
I was wondering if victims how they would view that, because it sounds like they have got a lot of thought put into the defendant, and I wonder how victims, do you have an experience of how victims view that? Because my understanding is victims will often say they're overlooked in the court process, and I wonder if the same, I mean, you might not know, but whether the same thought is given to the victims and the other witnesses that might be not expert witnesses and also find it very daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of support for witnesses, and witnesses, particularly vulnerable in any form of vulnerability, or child witnesses, will always be assessed to see if they need an intermediary, and they can have an intermediary to support them. And again, they can give their evidence from behind a screen, or what's often used with children, particularly if they're vulnerable children, they'll be in another room giving their evidence completely separate, with somebody sitting with them to support them, so that the only person they see on the screen is the person asking their questioning them. And there is also another scheme that was piloted and now I believe is now open to all courts, where a young person can just have their evidence videotaped way before the trial, and that's then just played to the court. They don't even have to come to court. Their evidence can just be played to the court, and the court can sit and listen. So there is a lot of support for witnesses out there. But I agree with you, Jerry, they often don't feel like that, particularly when they've been through such a traumatic incident. They often feel they're not supported in the way that they'd like.
I was really interested in what you were saying around when the criminal justice system might not perhaps adopt the most responsive approach and may send someone to prison when actually they could perhaps be managed in the community. And you were talking about the negative impact that might have on the young person. Could you say a little bit more about that? And are there any links between that negative impact and perhaps perpetuating risk?
A lot of young people I work with are away from their families for the first time. You put them in custody, they've never been away from their families. That's a massive impact. They may or may not have been in education, and there is education in all sort of secure children's homes and secure training centres and YOIs for under 18, and education is mandatory, but that doesn't mean they'll necessarily go. Some young people I work with will choose to stay in their cell rather than go to education, and they're not going to get the full range of educational experiences that they would in the community. And I've certainly worked with some quite bright young people who were doing GCSEs and A-levels who've not been able to continue those courses in custody. So their educational opportunities are curtailed. Simple things like they turn 17 in custody. A lot of 17-year-olds will learn to drive. They won't do that. And a big issue for a lot of the young people I work with is developing their sexual identity. In those last teenage years, when young people are experimenting sexually, having girlfriends, boyfriends, finding out what works for them, what doesn't work for them, experimenting and developing a sexual identity. You put somebody in prison at the age of 12 or 13, they miss all of that. And they come out as a young man without a sexual identity. And particularly if they've gone into custody when they've actually come in because they've engaged in sexually harmful behaviour or committed a serious sexual offence, that can be really, really hard to have not had any non-abusive sexual experiences and to come out as a young adult and have to develop that. The additional impact of young people who've come in for serious sexual violent offences and may leave custody, it can be very difficult for them to form relationships. They may have to, particularly the types of people I work with, disclosures may have to be made to their new partners about their offences. If they go on to have children, children's social care would, for a lot of those young men and women, have to be involved because of the nature of the offences they've committed. And I've certainly worked with young adults who've gone out and said, I'm just not going to bother. I'm not going to bother trying to form relationships because I can't bear the intrusion of all these people in my lives and any future partners' lives. And I think people just feel sometimes they just want to give up. I work with young people who, because of that and what a struggle it is when they leave, will resort to drugs, will have mental health breakdowns, will use drugs and alcohol to cope. So many of them say it is really, really hard to leave prison as a young adult. And I said, there's no research to back this up, but anecdotally, a lot of the young people I work with who are released as a young adult, having served a long sentence, are recalled at least once because they really, really struggle to adjust and reintegrate, even with a lot of support around them. My view has always been, if we could get in early, so if there were people like me working in schools, there's people like me working with them when people were starting to offend or were starting to show risky behaviours, if we as forensic psychologists could get in then and do some preventative work, just how I see my work in alternative education, it's preventative, how much better would that be, rather than waiting till, you know, a young person's killed another young person and then bringing me in to assess them and understand their function and their needs.
When I first started in my career, I started working in a young offenders institute, and then when I was invited to work at an adult, so I was thinking, well, it's too late. If they're an adult and they're still offending, it's too late, really. You do need to catch people when they're much younger, to sort of help them and get them out at that age, rather than come out and then reoffend.
That's what I love about my job. And I think when Ruth sent me off to Feltham, is that capacity for change. I'm sure you can relate to that, Kate, working at Aylesbury, that capacity for change. They're young enough to make massive changes. They haven't got entrenched attitudes and beliefs, and they're willing to listen and learn, and they are still developing. And if we can get in there earlier, where their brain is, you know, still plastic and molding, and show them different ways and provide them with relevant role models and advice and support, and, you know, present different ways to them that they may or may not choose to take, it's exciting. It's exciting to be there when there's still such a big capacity for change.
So what has been your proudest moment then in your career so far?
Completing my doctorate in 2 years, whilst working full time, when I was in quite a difficult personal situation, has to be. And on the day of my viva, when I got passed with no amendments and it went straight into the library, personally, that was a high point. And in terms of a more professional one, something we haven't talked about, but I have a special area of expertise in working with anonymity. So where children have been given anonymity as part of the court process to protect them, that runs out when they're 18. And a lot of people don't know that. Once they're 18, the press can have a free-for-all if they want to. And so I've got special expertise in working with those young people to, it depends on how I'm instructed, but would be what would be the impact of exposing this young person at the age of 18 and not allowing their anonymity to continue. And we've got lifelong anonymity. A number of young people I've worked with have all been granted lifelong anonymity. And part of the work I've done has become case law to support other young people who are coming through. People will refer to those cases I've worked on as how we might proceed legally with this young person. But more than that, their ongoing rehabilitation and potential for reintegration, if they're exposed at that time when they're moving from a youth offending team for probation, when they're moving from a young offenders or a secure training centre to the adult estate, all those changes are going on from they're perhaps leaving their social worker and they're moving to the leaving care team. To expose them at that point, it is huge. And some of the work I've done has become case law, and that's probably professionally one of the things I'm most proud of.
Louise, what are your future aspirations for your career, your hopes kind of for the next few years? What are you hoping to do?
I'd really like to do some pro bono work. So get involved with charities, or actually one thing I'd love to do is to use that time to mentor psychologists who perhaps want to get into forensic psychology but might be struggling for some reason, somebody perhaps who can't go and work for free somewhere, or one of the things that's really live for me at the moment is the fact that we are a predominantly white female profession. Where are the men? Where are the people from Black and ethnic minority groups? Where are those psychologists? We don't represent the people we serve. So could I do something usefully, perhaps with, although as an elderly white woman, maybe not, but with psychologists who have got the relevant qualifications but are male, and why are they struggling to get in, or why are we not attracting them, or psychologists from Black and ethnic minority groups? Could I support them? Maybe could they come and work with me one day a week, or could we have something to try and support the next generation in terms of mentoring or work experience? As I'm getting older and hopefully can pull back a little bit from paid work, to do something to support the next generation coming through, and particularly those groups who don't have the same opportunities to get in as others, those more vulnerable or marginalised groups who have almost certainly got the skills but that perhaps don't have the experience or the capacity to get that experience, to support them to have an equal chance at success.
So thank you to Louise for today, and thank you all for watching. The only thing left that we do say is let's talk forensic psychology.